Here we are, session 4 of ISA's summer sessions, the final session. It has been a great journey. What do you think? We've covered a bunch. How do you think it's gone?
It's been super informative. And what I love the most about it is like each individual expert that we've brought on has not only recognized the things that we've been discussing, but it's not just been a whole complain fest. It's like, hey, here's a problem. We recognize it. We all see it. Insert solution. And it's been the expertise of each individual that has added so much value. And this conversation is going to be zero exception to that rule because you already know, man.
Yeah, this is going to be a good one. I mean, I think that, without going too deep into it, today we're talking about content marketing. And, you can't talk about marketing in 2024 without talking about content marketing. And that's, for some of us, a newer thing. For others, they've been doing it for a long time and saw it unlock some serious potential. But I think we're at the point now where modern day marketing is demanding it. And it's really a tool that is underutilized. And it is something that I think can be a big difference maker, specifically for industrial marketers. So, Eddie, who did you find for us today to bring on as an expert? And, tell us a little bit about maybe how you got to know Chris, and then we'll bring him on, let him introduce himself.
Well, you cannot talk about the industrial space and mention marketing and collaboration in general without thinking the manufacturing happy hour. And you cannot think about the manufacturing happy hour without thinking about the man, the podcaster. I'd say one of the top, if not the top podcaster in the entire industry, Chris Luecke. Now, him and I go way back years, and he is actually the huge inspiration to why I started my podcast, Flex and Friends. He helped me kind of write that playbook, told me the do's and don'ts, saved me an immense amount of time. And really, everyone knows the content that he's making. So he is a true expert, and we couldn't have brought on anyone better in the industry to talk about this than the man, the myth, the living legend, Chris Luecke.
Nice. Well, let's open the door and bring him on in. Hey, Chris, what's going on, buddy?
How we doing? Stoked to be here. I knew Eddie would set a great foundation of energy before I even had a chance to step into the Zoom room. So in manufacturing happy hour fashion, I am ready to party. And by party, I mean, let's talk about content marketing today.
Nice. So before we jump into that, tell us what is manufacturing happy hour for those who don't know. What should we expect if we're tuning in?
Yeah, great question. So manufacturing happy hour, it is it's a platform, but on the surface, it is a leadership podcast disguised as a manufacturing podcast. So I'll fill you in on the story a little bit as we get into it, because it really started off as an accidental content marketing project when I was a salesperson. But it's a weekly podcast where we interview industry leaders about the latest trends and technologies impacting manufacturing. And the reason it's called Manufacturing Happy Hour is it's meant to be discussed in a candid way, as if you're having a beer with someone, right? Going beyond the buzzwords and really getting down into, hey, what's worked, what hasn't, where are the tangible examples? And we cover everything from Industry 4.0 to bring the next generation into manufacturing to, hey, how do I retain the talent on my team? How do I recruit the next generation? So it's everything from tech to leadership on the show. And then, of course, when you have a podcast called Manufacturing Happy Hour, you have to throw a party here and there as well. So especially this past year, it's really turned into an event platform as well, where much like we talk about big topics in our industry on the podcast, we throw events across the country to bring the manufacturing ecosystem in that region out to collaborate with one another.
Nice. I saw some stuff on some things happen in Milwaukee that looks like a lot of fun. How many episodes are you up to?
So you're a great point bringing up Milwaukee, because we did a 200th episode celebration in Milwaukee. Now, that's not including bonus episodes, so we're a little higher than that technically, but we are north of 200 episodes at this point.
Nice. Wow. Big milestone there. That's awesome. Well, that's going to lead into another topic that we get into it, I think, around consistency, right? But I'm really excited about this conversation, Chris and Eddie, and I'm really glad, Eddie, you brought Chris on. We had the opportunity to catch up in advance to this, guys, and what turned into about a 15, 20-minute prep call was like an hour and 20 minutes where we just could not stop talking about the things that we wanted to share. So I don't want to take away any of the time because I could barely fit it all into that hour and 20. We only have about 45 minutes left. Eddie, get us started in this conversation. Where are we going?
You know how we love to kick things off. We all have challenges as industrial marketers, and content marketing and collaboration, again, is no exception to that specific challenge. So, Chris, tell us about some common challenges or even like roadblocks that you've encountered when you've been creating and or distributing content. You've done so much of it. Challenges, roadblocks. What do you think, man?
Yeah, so when I started doing manufacturing happy hour, it was back in like 2016, 2017 was really when things got going. So back then, I could record a video of me talking about an automation solution. You know, it could be like a 3-minute long video. And if I shared the link to that YouTube video to LinkedIn, I'd automatically get reactions because I was one of the first to do it in this space. You know, I wasn't the first to record a video on my iPhone and post it to the internet. People had been doing that for a long time. I was looking at other industries to borrow those best practices. But like I said, back then, I was one of the only people creating content in the manufacturing space. There were others, but let's be blunt. There was less noise. There were less options of manufacturing content to look at. So I had that initial advantage back then. Now, fast forward about 7 years, lots of people are creating content. Content has become ubiquitous, and that is a good thing, right? Because people have understood it's like, hey, I can create content. I don't necessarily need a large budget to do it. I could do it on a DSLR camera. I could do it on my smartphone. So people are starting to get their voices out there. At the same time, when you get more voices out there, it becomes harder to break through the noise, as we'll call it. Not all content is created equal. And, you know, there is some, let's say, content fatigue, right? I think we're seeing more and more of it to the point that some people might be tuning out. So one of the challenges in this day and age is you need to be able to break through all the other options, all the other voices that people can be listening to in this space. And we'll definitely talk about how to do that in this presentation, but that's what I would say is one of the main challenges in this day and age. There are a lot of options for voices and content to listen to, so you got to figure out, how am I going to be heard by the people that need to hear my message?
So I want to take it back just before we get into the roadblocks and everything like that, and the how. I think most important is why. Why content? Why is that the delivery method that you think moves the needle, and why you've spent a significant amount of time over these last 7 years fine tuning it? Why content?
Yeah, so I'll start off with the answer, and then I'll tell a little story to back that up. It really fits around. It's really all about building trust. So I started off as a salesperson in the automation industry. This would have been 2010, really started to catch my stride in 2011. And I started my career in Houston, Texas. And that's very much a relationship-based market. The handshake is important. Building that relationship over lunch, over in-person meetings, that was clutch. Fast forward to 2015, and I moved from Houston to the San Francisco Bay Area, where a lot of people have their visions of what a typical worker in the tech industry might be like in San Francisco, right? They're young, they're in their 20s, their 30s, they're jumping companies every few years. And I needed a way to reach that audience. And my thought was, it's like, okay, so I'm in my 20s at this point in time. How do I consume content? Well, I listen to podcasts, I watch YouTube, I read blogs. I'm consuming it through all this digital media. So my thought was, it's like, okay, so if I'm going to build trust with a younger demographic, I need to meet them where they're hanging out via the medium that resonates with them. So I started sharing the videos. I started posting on LinkedIn more regularly. And the whole reason I did that was, the way I look at it, my LinkedIn presence, my digital presence was starting to replace my act of cold calling, for example. Like, you still want to reach out to companies, you know the people that might be a good fit for you. But if you have a message that's really catered to, let's call them your ideal customer, then if you post once a week, that's 50 plus posts a year. If you post twice a week, that's over 100 posts a year. Imagine if you're posting almost every day. That's an opportunity to make potentially over 300 impressions with your ideal customer. And obviously not all those posts are going to reach that person, but it really gets back to building trust. It is a regular trust building tool that if you put yourself out there, put you and your values out there, put your offering out there, people will start to see on a more regular basis. They'll know what you're all about. And when they do have a buying need, they might be more inclined to call you at that point. So it goes back to trust.
Trust. I love it. Now, like probably many people who are listening today and others that have had the conversations around content, I asked myself before I started making some things and trying some things out, why in the world do people want to listen to me? What is it about me that's unique? How can I provide value? I just recording my thoughts, what value is that to somebody else? So what would you tell that person that says, why would somebody want to listen to me?
Yeah, so why would someone want to listen to me? That's a great question. And the reality is not everyone probably wants to listen to you because, hey, you're and that's nothing personal, right? That's for everyone. That's not just about you, Brendan, but I'm glad we threw some humor into that. But the reality is, hey, if I'm, I think back to when I was an automation salesperson, not everyone is someone that had a need for automation equipment, for example. Someone that's working, back at that time in a fast food joint, for example, probably wasn't going to be my ideal audience, right? But the folks that work on automation inside of factories, at pipelines, whatever heavy industry or manufacturing process that might be, that type of person would have value from what I have to share. And I want to make sure that people don't confuse like value with a sales pitch, for example. Like you don't always want to be out there saying, hey, check out my new widget. It does X, Y, and Z. In fact, you rarely want to be doing that in your content strategy. If I'm sharing content for, let's stick with an automation audience, right? And let's get even more specific. Let's say a controls engineer. Then I'm going to share a piece of content maybe that's a post on LinkedIn that says, hey, here are 3 challenges that controls engineers are facing these days and how to overcome them. That would be an example of a piece of content that I could create that would cater to a specific audience. So you were asking, hey, why do I care? Well, if you dial in who your ideal audience is and who you have insight and where your insights could serve that audience, then, hey, you can build yourself up as an authority over time. This isn't going to happen when you hit post for the first time, right? It's a habit. It's a regular activity you need to create. But that's why people would want to listen to you is if you know who you're serving and you can really dial in your message for that persona, that avatar, as I like to call them, that's why someone would want to listen to you because you have a message for that specific person.
Makes sense. Well, people like listening to you. 200 episodes, so you've got a lot to say here. But Eddie, as I think about this, I mean, you do a lot of content too. Does this equate to, you running into somebody at a cocktail reception at a trade show, and you might not come up to them and say, hey, let me tell you about the product. You might get to know them a little bit. You might build that trust, have a relationship, and then it's something like that. Do you see it kind of the same way as the building of trust, or is it totally different? I mean, I'm trying to draw a parallel to a traditional method here so that people's light bulbs go off a little bit.
Yeah, well, that is what I call the phenomena of dark social. Those interactions that we talk a lot about attribution and a lot about the demand gen. I broke it down with our episode with Aaron Burrish on like demand creation and demand capture. What Chris is talking to is so much that creation where you're building that trust, you're controlling the narrative at scale, you're doing it so consistently that when that 5% who's actually ready to buy is there, you've already been catering to them for the previous parts of that funnel. So to me, when you're talking about handshakes, that's all part of dark social, which is very difficult to attribute, but it's a huge part in that demand creation because you've now humanized the brand with that handshake. And just honestly, it goes in the bucket of creation to me.
Yeah, I'm going to add something here if I can. I actually think how you're building relationships online is very similar to how you would build a relationship in person, right? Which is why it's so awkward and so obscure when you meet someone on LinkedIn for the first time and they immediately start pitching you what they do. You're like, dude, I don't even know you yet. I don't know if we have any synergies. I don't know if I like you yet. All these things, right? When you think of yourself at like a cocktail party, you ease into it, right? You're like, hey, my name's Chris. It's like, hey, what do you do? It's like, well, I'm a salesperson for automation, right? It's like, oh, tell me a bit more about that, right? You're not going to go into the pitch. You're going to build some trust. And here's what might happen in that scenario. They're like, that person may be like, you know what? I actually have someone on my team that you should talk to at some point. Or they may say, hey, this is not particularly applicable to me, but I know someone that you should probably meet, right? It's the same idea on social media. You're not always going to, hit the person you want to reach with that one post, but that's why tagging in the comments is so important. I mean, I think people might have seen that happen before where you post a piece of content and someone would say, hey, so-and-so, you really should check this out, right? It's the same type of thing. I think the more that we can think of social interactions as, the way we should be behaving when it comes to social media interactions, the better off we will all be.
I mean, it's in the word, social media, right? It's a perspective on that. And we've all gotten that cold pitch. You see the connection come in and then immediately a super long pitch on what it is that they're selling, and it's an immediate unfollow from me. So anyone out there listening, don't do that to me. We did get a question that came in here, and it might be skipping ahead, but I think it's a burning question for Maggie, so I want to ask it. Where do you find ideas for consistent content? That's from Maggie Sonic. Go ahead, Chris.
One more time. I want to make sure I got that correct. So where do you find ideas for consistent content? Got it. Okay. So I think one important thing, this is a little bit of a how-to, but whenever you come up with an idea that you're like, oh, that might be helpful to my audience, you don't have to share it right away. I think it's important to have something that people have called a swipe file. So when you have inspiration for something, you can add it to the library of things that you would post later. So, for example, if I am trying to share content, I'm trying to think of a new initiative on my own I'm sharing a lot about personal branding right now, right? How to build a personal brand. When I think of something, or when there is, or let's say I give a keynote talk on personal branding, I might have 10 little bits and pieces from that, like little videos that could be repurposed into little micro pieces of content. So I'm always kind of like tallying or keeping a note file saying, hey, here are things that I could talk about in the future. So that way, when inspiration hits, I can go in my Evernote. Maybe you use the Notes app, whatever it is, right? And you write it down and you can come back to that later. So that way, when creating content becomes a habit and you jump in on Monday or Friday to be like, hey, am I going to get a few posts queued up for next week? You have a baseline to go off of versus having to try to think of new things from scratch. And I think it goes back to always listening. I mean, as a salesperson, I would always be listening in my sales meetings. And if I hear something, it's like, gosh, that's a common question that comes up. I don't need to say, I was at XYZ account and this question came up. I could be like, a common thing that I keep hearing that's an issue for VPs of manufacturing in this industry is X. And then I can start a discussion around that online. So I think how do you find ideas for consistent content? Write them down as they come to you. Have what we call a swipe file in this industry so that you have a spot to store them, and always be listening. Look for that inspiration. So that way, when things do come up, or you're like, oh, that would be a worthwhile insight to share at some point, I think, you can make sure that's on the list. So I hope that was helpful for Maggie. If we can get a thumbs up or so from that.
Yeah. Thumbs up came through. Eddie, anything to add there?
I think this is actually a perfect segue into our next point, because if anybody knows or paid attention to anything I've talked about the last 5 or 6 years, it's, they've heard the buddy branding system a couple of times. So without digressing significantly into that, really the essence is collaboration. So Chris, kind of a question for you is, how are you approaching these collaborations? Because with you, 200 episodes, you've synergized with so many people, and I would potentially argue more people than anybody else in the industry, as far as I'm concerned. How do you manage that, and how do you approach that? Because you have to have some type of system and process after all that experience. Share it with us, bro.
Yep, absolutely. So, we were just talking about swipe files for managing your content ideas. You got to have a spreadsheet or some working document to manage who is on your guest wish list as well as who is already scheduled. So, you got to start building that out. When you first get started, right, it's not going to be scheduled 6 months out, right? Maybe you're just getting your first 5 guests lined up, right? But how do you prioritize collaboration? That is logistically speaking how I do that, right? I've got the wish list and I've got the list of people that are scheduled. I just make it a habit to make sure I'm around 6 months out in terms of scheduling content for my podcast, for example. Let's get in a little deeper into what that wish list, though. Why are these people on my wish list, for example? Well, it's because I know who my ideal audience is. First of all, they're having challenges around issues. I'm just going to give you a quick list of examples like cybersecurity. We talked about how do you recruit and retain talent. We talked about Industry 4.0. I'm going to have my wish list of experts that from my research, from being around the block in the industry, know that they would be able to address those topics because I know my audience cares about those topics. So it's kind of a two-step process. You got to go back to who your ideal customer persona is, who that avatar is, and thinking about, hey, what does this person care about? And then once you have that, then you can start building out who you collaborate with. And I'm very much talking from the standpoint of a podcaster right now. If you're a distributor, if you are a manufacturer, I mean, just think of the people you need to be collaborating with that might have a message for your audience, right? Think of if you're a distributor, you got so many manufacturing partners that you could be talking to, for example, or bringing into your content strategy. And I think that's very much a perfect example for like ISA, where you're creating that collaboration across different members of the manufacturing supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely fertile ground when it comes to people that are connected anyways. They're talking all the time, and so there's great conversations that are having. So I keep hearing people like Eddie and you say, always be recording, always be kind of thinking about the ways that you can leverage a conversation. One of the things that we wanted to talk about was amplification, though. Okay, so you've created a piece of content. So what, right? What do you do with it? How do you make it bigger? What can you do? I think there are some people believe that it's just like post and see what happens. Maybe. What else do you do to make your voice scale a little bit more?
Yeah, and I think this ties in perfectly with our collaboration discussion. The beauty of a podcast like Manufacturing Happy Hour, or the beauty of creating content with partners, is you automatically have at least one other person that can help amplify that content. I am always trying to think of, hey, it would be one thing for me to just jump on a microphone every week to talk about a manufacturing topic. Some people would tune into that, right? But I would lose the benefit of having potential amplification, especially right out of the gate. Like at this point in time, maybe if I did do a solo episode or a solo piece of content, if it was really relevant, if the message just rang home with a lot of folks, you might get some reshares, you'd get some comments and engagement out of that. But the better step, especially if you're just getting started with content, is to kind of build your partner ecosystem around you, to be like, hey, we're doing these first 5 pieces of content, whether it's a podcast, whether it's a social post, whatever it is, right? We're building these 5 pieces of content with these 5 different partners. So that way you have someone that can help amplify that message right out of the gate. And there are, of course, other strategies we can go into. I'm by no means an expert in like paid social. There are ways to get very pinpointed with how we get content in front of the right audience. But I'm trying to think of this from a budget standpoint and an I'm just getting started standpoint. I would look for partners. I would look maybe your best customers, for example. They could be someone to create a nice candid piece of content with. And you can even look, depending on how big your organization is, you can even look inside of your own team, because then it's not just you as an individual creating content. It's you as an individual creating content with your vice president of engineering and the VP of supply chain at your partner down the street.
Yeah, I mean, but just as you're talking about this, I think that content is a word that is, just kind of thrown out there. But somebody might say, "Oh, I can't do content marketing the way Chris is talking about. I don't really like being in front of a camera. That's just my thing." So, what are the other kind of content that person might be able to do, and is one better than other, or what makes content good?
This is a great question. And my simple answer, I'm going to try to keep giving the answers up front and then tell you why that's my answer as we go through it. That seems like a fun way to do it. The simple answer is play to your strengths. If you don't like being on video, there are two things. One, you can leverage a different type of content, or maybe you're just uncomfortable with it because it's new to you, right? And maybe you can start putting yourself out there a little more to try it out. Those are, the way I look at it, the two different ways you can do it. So one, maybe it's just some discomfort. Maybe you just need to get your sea legs a little bit and be ready to go. But hey, let's just say video isn't your strength, right? There are other ways to create content. You've got audio. We talked about podcasting. Not everything needs to be audio and video. You could just be on an audio podcast, for example. Or you could do written content. You could do picture content. In fact, I think some of the best, if I look at folks whose messages resonate the most, they do like little infographics or little images that illustrate a common issue that manufacturers face in industry. There are a lot of different ways you can do it. I think the simple answer is you got to play to your strengths. But one answer that is not appropriate is you can't just do nothing. Like you need to be putting content out there in some way, shape, or form. And we talked about images. We talked about written text, short form or long form. Those are both options. We talked about audio and we talked about video. You got to pick some of those to get started with. So I would look at the one, especially right out of the gate, pick the one that feels the most natural to you.
How about you, Eddie? What advice for those people that are squeamish about getting out there?
Sure. I mean, you can really, if you're talking about from a brand perspective, because I want to provide value back to the brands, I kind of break it down into three specific buckets of creation. Now, singularly, nothing you create should be one piece. Let me start there. Fractal is going to be the huge way to go. Like anything you need that you make needs to become a variety of different pieces. That's how you scale. That's how you reduce your effort from the long term. But if you're going to be making content, I think basing it on product, right? Field use or general thought leadership, because that gives you three solid buckets where you're now reverse engineering into themes and into specific topics and not just trying to find whatever sticks. And then when you have those buckets, it creates a solid foundation that you could build into and fill those buckets for longer form. But then also it allows you to be more agile, mobile, and hostile in case some big event comes up and you can kind of plan around it. But that seems to be a really good foundation that individuals can pull from and create their own bank, if you will. Like Chris is talking about having a bank of people you want to collaborate with. Why not take that same application and that same theory with creating that content so you can save yourself lots of work on the front end? So easier said than done, but it's not impossible by any means.
Yeah, I like that because I think a lot of people might be listening and saying, okay, I just need to do content. But that's not a reason why. I think that what your buckets establish is I want to be established as a thought leader, for example. And so that might be your reasons why you want to do it. And yes, that might lead to revenue down the road, but you have to have your why so that it's kind of your North Star of what it is when you get in front of a microphone or when you sit in front of your keyboard. What is it that you're going to be producing and why are you doing it? That's part of your brand. So I do think that there is, for those that are getting started, a lot of times there is a lot of waffling in direction of what it is that you're doing. You might veer into lanes that you shouldn't, which kind of leads to another question. What are some like absolute no-nos when it comes to content? I mean, you mentioned one, don't straight up pitch. What else? I mean,
overthinking it. Don't overthink it. Like that is, I think people, the common thing for folks to be worried about is, what if I say the wrong thing? What if I don't describe it the right way? Is this going to derail my business? Is this going to derail my career? The reality is most pieces of content, mine included, get sucked up into the ether of social media very, very quickly. You post it, maybe, you know, let's say it's a LinkedIn post, you probably have a day for it to resonate and catch the right audience. After that, it kind of just slowly disappears. And, you know, it's not going to be front and center of someone's feed anymore, right? That's why I got to post again and again. So my biggest piece of advice is when it comes to, hey, things you should be like cautious about. You covered it right before this, right? You said, hey, don't pitch. But I think the other thing that, like, it's almost the opposite of being cautious. It's like, you just got to get out there and start building the habit. Like, especially early on, I know a lot of people are like, oh man, they're like, I don't have a big audience yet. No one's consuming my content. Great. That gives you time to experiment in a risk-free zone. Start sharing a variety of pieces of content for a variety of audiences. Maybe you're thinking engineers are your primary audience, but you realize your messaging is really resonating more with operations leaders, for example. Those early days are a great time to start figuring that out. It's like, okay, I thought this was going to resonate with this group. It really started picking up with this group. Well, what else does this other group care about? How can I start doubling down on serving that group, right? If that group is relevant to you. You don't want to go after someone that isn't one of your ideal buyers per se, but you want to be experimenting to figure out what is resonating. And the best way to do that is to share content. Don't overthink it. You know, do your best to, make sure it's authentic. I was going to say polished, but the real thing you want to make sure is that it feels natural, doesn't feel forced, and then start listening to the feedback. And that feedback might be very limited at first. That's okay because you're just experimenting. So don't overthink it. Start getting the content out there.
Yeah. As I think about it, I think other people see a potential roadblock or a reason why not to do it is they're not sure what your setup looks like, where you are. They can see a nice fancy microphone in front of you. And maybe they think, well, he's got somebody that does all the editing, or he knows, how to use complex software in order to do that. I'm a marketing department of one, or I have no budget for something like this. What do you say to that individual who's like, I can't do it. I don't have the equipment or the expertise in how to do this.
Yeah, so for probably all of 2017, like I was just using this to create all my content. I was just using the phone, and I give people, I can't remember if it was in a blog post where I first put this, but I always say I would much rather watch a video of a CEO of a machine shop, for example, walking around, just taking a quick selfie saying, hey, this is what's going on my shop floor today, right? If they can share it. I would much rather see that, maybe slap some captions on it with a free captioning tool that's available online. I'd rather see that than something that is overly produced, took 3 months and an insane amount of budget to create, that maybe that expensive piece of content you made just falls flat. I think like you got to go in order. Figure out what works by using this thing first, especially when you don't have a budget. And then once you realize you have an audience, once you realize what message is really starting to stick, then you can invest in maybe some equipment and amplifying that message and polishing it up a little bit. But I still think a phone is the best way to start experimenting with video content, for example, because the camera on this thing is way better than any camera you could have purchased like 15 years ago. So never forget that. And the audio is good too. The thing I'll say is most people, when they're talking about the equipment they need to get started, they're just using the equipment as an excuse to be like, oh, well, I'm not really ready to put myself out there yet, so I'm going to hem and haw over this particular camera I need to get. And then, 6 months go by and you're like, oh gosh, I guess I never really started doing that. You don't want to fall into that area. You just got to get started.
And oftentimes those cameras are not so easy to operate either. I mean, this is point and click with the phone. Those cameras, you need some training and some expertise in order to do it and set it up and get the settings right. So, I think it's a good point, and it shouldn't be a roadblock to create. So, yeah, Eddie, where are we going next?
I mean, plenty of directions, but I think what we'd like to do is we've definitely identified some, let's call it just bottlenecks or just some issues, some friction points. So let's take a step back because we know there are success stories, plenty of them that come along with collaboration specifically. So Chris, do you have like an example in your mind where it was just an awesome high level of synergy and it played a significant role in the success of a campaign?
Yeah, this is the example that's really starting to stick out right now is it kind of goes beyond social media a little bit. And I'm going to go with this example because I think it's important. The reason I create content is so that when I have an in-person interaction, it's that much more meaningful than it would have been had I just met that person for the first time with no context for our relationship. So if I've been building a relationship with someone, even if it's just kind of in the background, right, for 6 months, just because I've been creating content online, when I get to an event, let's say I'm hosting a manufacturing happy hour event, there is already trust there built with that person. And I think it's, I know this probably isn't the direction you were thinking I would go with this, but I think of manufacturing happy hour events or industry events in general as where the power of content marketing really shines through the most, because we can talk about, hey, what does success look like? How do you measure success in content marketing? Very recently, I was, hosting an event where one listener of the podcast was interacting with another listener for the podcast for the first time and realized they really needed to collaborate. One of them was hosting a trade show and the other ran an association for manufacturers in that state. It's like, well, put them on a bus and send them up to the trade show, right? So that was a perfect example of folks that we'd been building relationships online through content. And when we got in the same room, then all of a sudden, that's where the magic happens. And I gave the example of an association going to a trade show, but it could very much be, I've seen this happen as well. Maybe a systems integrator and an end user meet in a room as well, or a distributor and a manufacturer. There are a lot of different ways that could happen. I look at that social element of social media so closely when it comes to content marketing, because I think we get lost a lot of times in the likes, in the comments, which are important, and we can talk about that more here. But I think one of the most underrated measures of the success in content marketing is how it translates to a meaningful in-person interaction that results in some sort of business, some sort of action taken, etc.
No, I really love that. I mean, and I think this is a big separation from if you're using content marketing as a way to build trust. You were talking about it replacing cold calls at the beginning. Cold call was a one-to-one conversation. The person you were calling never talked to another person you were calling. Now you're leveraging the power of your collective audience, which I think is a multiplier, and it's almost like it grows on its own, the value, without you really having to do anything. You just kind of brought this together through your content. I think it's powerful if you can harness it. So that's an interesting example and a clear separation. I think elevation of value when it comes to content marketing. Yeah, Eddie,
for sure, without a doubt. Without a doubt. And it's just another testament to just that continued focus. I hear lots of trends in the conversation here, but keeping the driving forward, because I know we were dabbling in a couple of other upcoming topics here. Chris, you had mentioned earlier there's just an abundance of content online, and so you were just getting inundated, hit with it all day. So like the fizzle is real. It's fast and it's real. But how do you, as an expert, ensure that what you're creating and putting out there actually stands out and resonates and doesn't just hit the fizzle real quick, man?
Yeah. There isn't a single answer to this. I'm going to share the one that's sticking out at me the most right now, is that I try to make my content as human as possible. And this is, I'll share how this applies to me. I'm a podcaster, right? So when I share things, when it's related to my business, it automatically really comes out as my voice, as a human voice, as Chris Luecke's voice. That's not necessarily the case for a big brand that has, it doesn't even need to be a big brand. Maybe you have 50 employees, right? If you're sharing content from your company page, it's not going to have the same type of human effect. What I would say is one of the most underrated strategies to get content to stick out is showcasing the personalities and the values and the expertise of the people on your team. If you are doing all of your content through your company page today, for example, start turning that company content into Bill's content or Sally's content or Jack's content or Jane's content, for example. Start showcasing the personalities of the people and their expertise. Showcase the folks that work for your organization and get your insights out that way. Because then if you're a large company, at the end of the day, you want to get more customers, right? Let's not sugarcoat this too much. At the end of the day, there is an objective to content marketing. It's marketing. We're trying to reach our audience and eventually make some sales. So we don't want to forget that. But it's going to be a lot easier to build that trust if they feel they just built that relationship with Bill or Sally or Jane or Bob versus a nebulous brand. So how do you get content to stick out? I would try to find ways to really start highlighting the expertise of your organization in the context of the people that work for that organization.
I love it. I love it. You mentioned something that I think sticks out to me is you talked about sales and the connection to revenue. I mean, there's a lot of people out there, and we've covered this in the other three as well, that are searching for ROI and ways to show ROI. How do you see the ROI of content as it relates to sales? I know in our prep we touched on this a little bit, but when do you realize the impact, and how do you kind of internalize your investment in time today versus the impact tomorrow?
Yeah, I think you got to look at this as a long-term play. This is not, we're not doing content marketing to hit our numbers this quarter. We're doing content marketing so it's easy for us to hit our numbers and our revenue goals a year from now. I think the most important thing is to go in with that mentality, knowing that the big wins aren't going to come immediately. I've had too many conversations where people are looking for big wins right out of the gate. And you can highlight small wins, right? You can highlight, hey, our posts are getting more engagement. We have more followers. We're getting more meaningful conversations that are turning into sales discussions. Those are good short-term wins, and you absolutely want to be paying attention to those. But if you're really measuring the ROI, I would be looking at this, first of all, as a trust-building activity. And again, if you can start humanizing 8 to 10 of the people on your team as faces of your brand over the course of the year, for example, and if those people have, here's what I would look for like tangible results. Like, are people walking up to that individual at a trade show after 9 months or 12 months being like, hey, I've been seeing you on LinkedIn more often? Like, I would pay attention to that type of thing wholeheartedly. Now, I don't want to be too explicit. I'm trying to think of the right way to describe it. Like, it is okay to start experimenting after a while, to be like, hey, we're sharing a lot of insights. What happens if we say, hey, you should come to our webinar, for example? You can put those posts in there. Jab, 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 Right Hook by Gary Vaynerchuk is still one of my favorite books on social media, because the whole premise is, in boxing, you don't come out and try to land a right hook right away because you're going to get knocked out. You wear them down through jabs. And the way to think about it, and that's the updated version of the book right there, Day Trading Attention. But the general premise is, a jab is you providing an insight online, right? Jab here, jab there, you're providing those insights. So that way, when you make an ask, like, hey, sign up for my webinar. Hey, come to my trade show booth. And by the way, those asks should be a small fraction of the amount of your posts. But those are the jabs eventually lead up to the trust that makes someone more likely to say, oh yeah, I might actually go to that webinar, right? I'm going to sign up for that. All too often, I get on LinkedIn and I see someone show up for the first time in 6 months and be like, good news, we're going to be at this booth at this trade show. It's like, how is that good news? Like, I haven't heard anything from you for a long time. What context is there for this announcement, right? So I think of it that way. So back to my point, there are little things you can do to look for short-term small wins, comments, engagement, etc. But you really got to be thinking about this as a long-term play. Like, this is something that's going to make your life easier years down the line, not months.
You see it the same way, Eddie?
I mean, you know me, I'm going to go back to my not broken record, but demand gen. And that's why I'm going to be preaching from the mountaintops over all of my, remaining speaking engagements, just to ensure that people understand that if we're looking at the whole pie, that about 95% of your market is still in that research phase, doing anywhere from 65 to 80+% of their research online before they even talk to you. So why are we not putting immensely more data, attribution, and effort into that 95%, while everybody else, let's be honest, is focusing on how can I get as much of this 5% as possible? Like, I get that that's cute and that's worked for a certain amount of time, but we need to shift our mindsets. We really need to. And I think these conversations are helping do that. And content is the vehicle, ladies and gentlemen. It is the vehicle. Distribution will be the queen, while the content will be the king and the castle, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, we're not talking about the immediate person-to-person interaction going away or a sales function going away. It's just maybe has moved down in the funnel a little bit, and so that top of the funnel fill, I think, is an exciting place to be investing your time and looking at ways that you can pull from a lot of different directions, and content marketing is certainly one. Landing page generation, all these things that allow people to learn about you and interact with you before you make that phone call. I think that it's warming the lead, but just done at scale, which is kind of cool.
I like that you talked about warming the lead, because I know earlier on I said, hey, my social media strategy was to start replacing my cold calling strategy. I want to be very clear. Like, we were talking about how you can use this phone as a good tool for creating content. It is still a good tool as a phone as well. Social media just makes it much easier to make a warm call with context to said individual versus something with no context in this day and age. So I always want to make sure, as people are thinking of these newfangled ways of reaching audiences, that don't forget there's still a lot of really good old school tactics that work well, that if you couple that with like a digital strategy, you make those all the more powerful.
I think another point that's just interesting to make is both of these guys on this show today were successful salespeople that now do content marketing. So they unlocked something that worked. And I think it's not that they understand that sales is not important. This makes sales easier, which I think resonated really well when Chris was talking about. We had a long conversation around this: is what can make sales easier, because sales is hard. It is. I mean, you're convincing somebody to trust you, to believe you, and so if you can get a little bit of trust even before you talk to them, that's a win.
As an ex-salesperson, I would challenge, I assume the audience here is mostly marketers, but make sure you're giving this message to your sales folks as well, because they can be lethal when they have a personal brand and a content marketing strategy of their own. Again, this is not the thing that's going to help them hit their number this quarter, but it is the type of thing that's going to make them way more valuable to the industry and your customers in the long run as well. So a lot of the things we talked about today are not just limited to the marketing person having to bear the brunt of all of it. Once you get a salesperson sold on this, or an executive sold on this strategy, your job as a marketer becomes a lot easier, because then that person's out there speaking and saying great things about your organization on a regular basis as well.
Yeah. Mary Keogh was on last week, and we were talking about using trade shows as a way to bring decision makers and people together to create content. I think she said from one event, it was 12 months of content that they had planned. And so I think that is it leads me to another kind of question of if marketing is going over to sales or going up the chain to their CEOs and senior decision makers, how do you get that light bulb to go off? I mean, marketers, I think, are inherently going to believe in this a little bit more because they believe in the principles of marketing. They know and are trained in the principles of marketing, and so it's translatable. But how do you get a salesperson to say, "You want me to talk to my phone?"
Yeah,
like, wouldn't you rather me talk to a person?
Yeah, I would say this is a fun one, right? I would, if I'm the marketer, I'm gonna book an hour on that salesperson's time or that executive's time. And I'm just going to kind of have a casual conversation where I'm like, I'm going to try to pull out some insights, right? One of the nice things about doing a long form discussion like this is not everything that I say or you say or Eddie says has to be a home run insight, right? We do hit some home runs in the process, right? But it doesn't mean every moment of it is like that's the thing we got to publish the next day. So if you can just grab like 30 minutes of that person's time, you could do it on Zoom, or get the iPhone set up. Maybe you have a camera, whatever it is, right? And you record in a quiet room. Those are some things you can do as well. So if I'm the marketing leader, I'm going to start trying to grab some time where I'm going to be recording and creating some content with said individual. And then, hey, share it online, tag that person. They start seeing it. They're like, huh, okay. All right. This is interesting. I'm getting some traction here. You're going to have to do a little hand holding at first for most people. But if you have someone that is willing to create content, this is a extremely important message for the marketing leaders. Do everything you can to amplify that person like crazy and encourage them and collaborate them, because the last thing you want to do as a marketer is discourage someone because, oh, what if they say something that's just slightly off brand, right? Again, it goes back to one of my earlier points. Most content gets sucked up into the ether of social media right away. Work with that individual, collaborate with that individual to get content out there. So again, if it's someone that maybe they're not willing to create content right away, nudge them a little bit, get them in a room and record some content. If there's already a person out there that you're clearly seeing has a voice and they're ready to share it, like double down on that person right away. Work with them like crazy.
Love it. Love it. All right, Eddie, take us home. We got 9 minutes left in this awesome summer sessions, and of all of the summer sessions. So you got to wrap it up with a bang, dude. What do you got for Chris as a zinger to take us home?
One last thing, I love keeping former salespeople, as a recovering sales guy myself, honest. And if you have a salesperson who is reluctant to put themselves out there, I'm a former sales guy. I like to be a smart ass a little bit, excuse me, but I say, since when was being in front of your audience a bad thing, salesperson?
Yeah.
I digress, and I'll put the gloves back on. But that being said, it's not about that, but here we are. Knowing this, okay, so content marketing, Chris, it's growing, it's expanding, and it's going to continue to evolve. But in what ways do you think it's going to evolve, seeing the trends and patterns that you're seeing every single day?
That's a fun question. I am not really going to talk about AI and artificial intelligence because I think you got to get good at your own voice first and being authentic, creating the things that come to mind for yourself. AI can be a tool later on, but that's not the point of today's conversation. I think one thing that's really going to stand out, I mean, the fact that some people are taking what I'll say a bit of a lazy approach and letting AI do some of their work right now, the more you can humanize your content, the better off you will be at standing out. One way I do that right now is while a lot of other people are using AI generated images to promote their events, I work with local artists and muralists to promote my content, right? Because one, that's another person that can amplify my stuff. It's cool. It stands out. It's beautiful. And hey, at the end of the day, we're in the manufacturing, we're in the industrial space, but we're human. We love art, right? So I'm trying to double down on the human side and working with more artists and making sure I'm being as authentic as possible with my voice and humanizing it as best as possible. That's where I think things are going, because I think for at least in the immediate future, it's going to become pretty apparent who's taking a lazy approach to creating content and who's really genuinely putting their heart into it.
I appreciate the veering out of the AI conversation there. There is a lot talking about the future as it relates to AI, and I know we should be talking about it to some degree, but I believe, as you do, that the future is human, and that will be the differentiator. If you can create content that is unique to your voice, it will stand out against a lot of people who are being lazy. So I think your point is good. Eddie, what do you think? I mean, you asked a good question. I want to hear your thoughts.
I want marketers in the industrial space to not only get up to speed, but to stay ahead of the curve. And now this is not a shameless plug by any means, but like I really do believe in the idea of leaning out what we do as marketing, and specifically in the industrial space, because I believe that we can accomplish way more than what this robust amount of efforts that we're placing. And so I feel individuals looking at other entities or looking outside for content creation is going to be something you see way more, because it's, if you think about it, it takes an entire team of, let's say upwards of 3 individuals sometimes to do your graphics, your videos, and then your copy, because those are all 3 specific disciplines. So I believe in order to alleviate the stress that can come with having to, hire out that team and build that out, I really think that looking at external creators and efforts is going to be a huge uprising from not only a cost saving standpoint, but from like a guaranteed execution, consistency, and strategic standpoint. So these industrial marketers can push ahead, look at a 10,000 foot view, and be way less tactical and be more strategic, because that's what industrial marketing needs. We need to fix our KPI system, and we need to be way more strategic and way less reactive.
No surprise there from Eddie on this one. This is his whole thing, is we just need to be ahead of the curve. A hot take on that question though. What about traditional content? I mean, content has been around forever. Most industry areas, industrial is no exception, has a trade publication, straight up, like long form articles written like that. The attention span gets lower and lower every single year for every person that exists on this earth. And I'm looking at content that comes out in 30-minute clips, TikTokification, if you will. Do you see that replacing industry publications or trade mags? Or do they have to evolve? I mean, they do have to evolve, but do they still exist?
Good question. I mean, I'm treating them like they still exist today, right? Traditional media still exists. Heck, I mean, if I look at my own personal content distribution strategy, I have not tapped into traditional media enough to experiment with how that's going to get me in front of my audience. What you want to be thinking of, where is my audience hanging out, and what platform or what medium is going to reach them? So I know that my audience is hanging out on LinkedIn, and I know that they're hanging out on the podcast platforms. I am now creating content that doubles down on those platforms. So the next thing I'm thinking of is, hey, is there another spot that all these people are hanging out that I'm currently not hanging out at, right? So I'm still looking at traditional media, and I'm also looking at TikTok and things like that, especially as, Gen Z becomes the tool belt generation, and how it's made style content resonates well on TikTok because the context of that platform fits so nicely with a quick clip of how it's made, for example. Those you just got to be paying attention, but you don't want to spread yourself too thin right out of the gate. If I am starting my content marketing strategy, I am thinking of 1, maybe 2 platforms right out of the gate where I'm going to double down and focus my efforts. And then once I get good at those platforms and know I'm reaching the right audience through those platforms by measuring all the things we talked about today, comments, engagements, face-to-face interactions at trade shows after that, that's when I would start looking at different platforms. So your original question was a little different, right? You're like, hey, do you see traditional media going away? I don't think it's disappearing right away, but you're right. It has to evolve. And in my standpoint, that's an area where, maybe you've developed a really good, mature digital strategy, and it's time to start looking at some of those other areas.
I love it. Yeah, I'll reserve. We have great relationships with our trade publications here, but I think everybody has to evolve. Nobody is exempt from having to look at where customers are in the future and trying to meet them there. So, Eddie, we did it, man. 2:59 Eastern time. Summer sessions coming up to a close, but I thoroughly enjoyed all these conversations today, included Chris. You did a great job of really demystifying some I think widely held beliefs around content, why you can't start it, how to overcome those, how to get started, some principles to adhere by. All these things are so good. If you guys are out there and you want to find out more, hit up Chris or check out his Manufacturing Happy Hour. It's a really cool podcast. A lot of good conversations, and it's been around for a little while now. So it's definitely has a great following. Eddie, you can find him as well. He's all over LinkedIn, and check him out at his company, Speak Friend. this is the kind of conversations we want to be having at ISA here. We want to be bringing a modern look at everything that we do in our businesses, not just marketing. Why don't we have these similar conversations around operations, IT, HR, sales, whatever it is? We all need to be looking at what kind of business we're going to be running in the future. And marketing is just one, I think, that is very exciting to me personally. So Eddie, I want to thank you for helping me put this together. You did a great job. Chris, thank you for joining us today. Also want to do a special shout out to Destiny Barr, our event director, who helped us on the back end. None of this happens without Destiny and the rest of the ISA team that helped us put this together. But Eddie, any last words before we sign off summer sessions?
Make noise, be bold, question, experiment, inspire, and engage.
Nice. All right, Chris, last words?
My last words are a very quick call to action. In the spirit of content marketing, if you're still here and you're still listening to us, it's all about developing the habit of sharing content. So after this call, if there is a takeaway that sticks out to you, feel free to share your number one takeaway from this discussion on LinkedIn. Tag Brendan, Eddie, and myself, as well as ISA, and start a discussion. Get in the habit of creating that content. And like I said earlier, don't overthink it. That would be my initial call to action to get into the content marketing spirit.
Nice. I'm looking forward to seeing all those posts. I mean, we're seeing some good comments here on the side, super informative, nicely done, all that kind of stuff. And that feels good, but I want to hear the actual takes. So I'm looking forward to seeing those comments out there on LinkedIn. I'll sure be liking them, sharing them, tagging them, doing all that fun stuff. But from me and the ISA team, guys, I just want to say thank you to all of you out there in the audience. Thank you for taking this seriously and for taking your companies and investing your time to be here and to join us and to help evolve. So on behalf of the ISA team and everybody else, signing off summer sessions for the summer 2024. More content coming though, guys. We're working on it right now. So everyone have a great week. Be well and start posting today.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.